Welcome to this latest episode of Canonically Speaking. Today my guest is Margaret Koterba, who is of Polish origin but currently settled in England and working in the Diocese of Salford. She is a wife and mother and is currently judge at the Salford Tribunal. Also, since 2023, she's been an advocate at the newly established National Tribunal Service for England and Wales for the application of penal law in the Church. My interest for this podcast was aroused when I saw some articles Margaret had written on the concept of noogenic immaturity in relation to marriage consent. So noogenic meaning relating to the mind or intellect, from nous or nous in Greek, is a concept introduced at the level of the Roman Rota, which is the highest court of appeal for marriage cases, by Monsignor Erlebach, one of the judges on the Rota, and it's related to Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, which, as I understand it, in very broad terms, posits that finding meaning in life is crucial for psychological well-being. So we'll be talking about that today and how the concept may have an impact on the consent that a person gives at the time of contracting marriage. But prior to that, I wonder if I could ask you, Margaret, to explain a little bit about your background, how it was that you came to be in England, what brought you into canon law, and what your present role is.
Thank you, Father, for having me. So, yes, I'm a Polish canon lawyer. That's what I like to describe myself as. And I graduated from Theology and Canon Law. And when I was studying theology, it was the second year of my studies when we were, as students, introduced to canon law. From that point, I started being very much interested into canon law. And once I graduated from theology, I decided to extend my study years and my student life. And I started studying canon law. And I graduated from canon law. I gained a PhD in canon law. How did it happen that I was settled here? During my doctoral studies in 2016, I came to England under the Erasmus program, which involved gaining some practical experience. And thankfully, the Tribunal of the Diocese of Lancaster accepted my person, me as a little helper in the tribunal. And that's how I came for the basically student internship for 6 months in Lancaster. And when that period was coming to an end, Diocese of Salford heard about me, and at that time they were in need of a canon lawyer, and they asked me whether I would like to come initially for 10 months, but the 10 month turned into a never-ending story. And since 2017, I've been working at the Tribunal of the Diocese of Salford, firstly initially as a defender of the bond, and since 2023 as a judge.
Now, for the benefit of any non-canonists who may be listening, could you explain a little bit about how consent given by one or both of the parties may turn out to have been defective or ineffective despite their good intentions? I mean, this is what you're dealing with as a judge on the tribunal.
So, as you mentioned, Father, for the benefit of those who are not familiar with canon law, I think I should start from explaining what makes up marital consent. So, canon law gives a good description of what marital consent is. It is an act of will by which a man and a woman give themselves to each other to establish a marriage. So, for this consent to be valid, there are a few conditions that must be met. The first one is that the marital consent must be a true human act. What does that mean? That it means that it has to be free, deliberate, and made with adequate understanding and intention. The other condition, the second condition, is that the parties, the person, must be capable of consent. So, in other words, they must know what they are agreeing to. So they must know the terms and conditions. What we require is not the perfect or extensive knowledge of marriage, but rather the basic, the minimum understanding of marriage. Means that it's a permanent union, exclusive, means between one woman and one man, directed towards the good of the spouses and the children if they happen to be in the marriage. The third condition is that the marital consent has to be free. So cannot be made under any coercion, pressure, fear, or deceit. And the last condition is that the marriage consent has to be expressed according to church law, so typically in a proper form and before witnesses. So if we want to talk about marital consent that might be defective or ineffective, some of these elements that I've just mentioned have to be gravely disturbed, and that grave disturbance needs to be proven throughout and during the process.
So if we're talking about particularly psychological conditions or deficiencies, what are the main kinds of such deficiencies that are typically cited in sentences of the Roman Rota as causes of incapacity for consent? And how does this differ from, for example, simply being young or naive?
In most cases of nullity, if we are dealing with psychological conditions that affect the validity of the consent, they fall under Canon 1095, which outlines 3 psychological grounds. The first one is the lack of use of reason. And sometimes here we deal with some mental illnesses. The second one is the grave lack of discretionary judgment about the essential rights and essential duties of marriage. And this is often cited in cases where a person cannot grasp what marriage truly requires. And the third one is the psychological incapacity to assume essential obligations, meaning that the person might understand marriage, might possess the minimum knowledge, understanding of marriage, but cannot live it out due to deep psychological issues. And these 3 conditions often involve some serious mental disorders or serious deep-seated personality disorders. Among those, there are, for instance, schizophrenia, chronic alcoholism or drug addiction, or gambling, or any other addiction that would affect the reason and the will of the person. Some severe personality disorders like narcissism or extreme immaturity. Roman Rota also mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive or depressive conditions. However, this list is not exhausted, and the fact that it's not exhausted is very well proven in the new development of Monsignor Erlebach. And going back to the second part of your question about being young or naive, being young or naive is not a ground for the nullity itself. But if throughout the process it is proven that the young age or naivety gravely and seriously disturbed the person's reason and free will, then we might actually consider young age or naivety as a cause for the nullity. However, this is not a condition, as we would say, sine qua non. So it's not a ground for the nullity itself.
Now, homing in on this particular concept then of noogenic immaturity, How was it that you came across Monsignor Erlebach's judgment in the first place?
Monsignor Erlebach is a very, very well known in his homeland priest. He comes from Poland, even though his last name doesn't sound very Polish. And he has served as a judge in the Roman Rota tribunal since 1997. I have had a privilege of having him as my mentor during my canonical practice. And a few years ago, he shared with me an article that he had written, sadly in Spanish only, presenting the new concept that he was developing. It took me a while to engage myself fully with this article and the sentence related to this new development. But since both the article and the sentence was written in Spanish Latin, very few English-speaking canon lawyers were even aware of the concept. So I decided that it would be a great idea, a very helpful idea, I hope, to take on the role of being his English voice. And with his blessing, I started studying the concept, his understanding, and the sentence and the article a bit deeper, because my main goal was to help bring his idea to a wider audience, but also get myself familiar with this new concept.
What about the case itself? What were the main features of it? What was it that led Monsignor Erlebach to come to this conclusion that in the particular circumstances there was this noogenic immaturity?
So the case from 2017 was examining a marriage. The marriage lasted 2.5 years, and the courtship that lasted a bit longer was marked by the same, let's call it the woman's attitude, as they were then manifested in the marriage life. The woman, she came from dysfunctional family dynamic. Her mother was very domineering. Her father was very passive. And the woman was very submitted to her mother, to the extent that she wanted to gain her approval and in anything that she would do in her life. Throughout the courtship and also the marriage, the woman was focused on seeking pleasure in her life, seeking freedom. And she had this unrealistic idyllic idea of marriage and the relationship prior to marriage, the relationship that would be focused on money, on pleasure, fun, and beauty, because at some point, even during the marriage, towards the end, she neglected all the marital life, and she got herself into modeling. During the marriage, she neglected, as I've mentioned, she neglected home. She refused to seek any medical advice when they were trying to conceive. She avoided a shared life with her husband. So she, even though they were trying to get their own place, once they achieved that, she did not eventually move in with her husband. She stayed with her parents. Obviously, she withdrew from intimacy, and ultimately she left her husband for another man. But on the other side, throughout the courtship and the married life, she was extremely jealous of her husband, but also she failed to reciprocate love and care. So in overall, Monsignor Erlebach described this as a lack of any values in her life. And that's how he, based on this case, that's how he developed noogenic immaturity.
Now, I mentioned in the introduction that this is linked with the logotherapy of Viktor Frankl. Can you make explicit what that link is?
Yes. So to properly explore this question, I think we need to start from the roots of noogenic immaturity, which takes us back to mentioned by you, Viktor Frankl. He was Austrian psychiatrist, and during his practice, he noticed that especially among his young patients, they were patients who were not depressed in the clinical meaning, but they felt aimless, bored, and morally confused. And that's what he called the existential frustration. And this led to his idea of noogenic neurosis. So the neurosis that was caused by lack of meaning in life, simply saying. So after the war, he developed logotherapy, the method that was focused on helping people to find meaning in their life.
Logotherapy, of course, means healing through meaning.
Yes. So in short, logotherapy helps people to identify and embrace a purpose in life, which can sustain them through hardship and guide their choices.
Frankl, of course, had been in a concentration camp, in several concentration camps.
Yes.
And found meaning for himself there.
Yes, despite a really hardship that he went through, because in the camps he lost not only his parents, but his brother and his wife. And also, while being there, he noticed that some of the prisoners were more likely to survive if they had a purpose in their life. So, for instance, if they had job left outside of the concentration camp, if they had their family, their loved ones. So logotherapy was also started developing also in the concentration camps.
So how do we link this with Monsignor Erlebach's development of the concept?
So Monsignor Erlebach builds on Frank's idea when he developed the concept of noogenic maturity. And he classifies noogenic maturity under psychoaffective immaturity. At its core, it reflects a disturbed value system that affects the person's reasoning and free will, so those two core elements of marital consent. Some early signs can often be found in dysfunctional backgrounds, just like in the case that he examined in the family background of the woman, of the respondent in that case. Those signs of, for instance, like dishonesty, emotional manipulation, possessiveness in relationship, or pleasure only in their lives. Erlebach also highlights the complex relationship between the stored values as a cause or effect. And in some cases, the path is quite clear. Children not taught deeper values might grow into pleasure-seeking adults. In others, unresolved existential crisis in adolescence might play a major role. So various factors, biological, psychological factors, social factors, or even a refusal to take responsibility can all contribute to noogenic maturity.
So some of these factors, perhaps most of these factors, are things that might not be picked up by a standard psychological report. Would you agree with that?
Yes. That's why I think the biggest message that he would like to pass on to the canon lawyers is that we have to go back to and start treating seriously Christian anthropology when we are assessing person's capacity to make a valid marital consent. What he means by that is that we need to remember that the person is a unity of, according to Christian anthropology, is a unity of body and soul, a body and spirit, if someone would like to describe it in that way. So that system of values brings our attention not only to assessing person in the very psychological way, but also look into their spirit, look into their value system, which quite often is, well, sadly neglected in the tribunal experts' reports.
Would you be willing to hazard a guess or make a prediction about the future of this concept within canonical jurisprudence? Do you think it will become a more common ground in declarations of nullity, or do you think its use will remain quite limited?
I think that obviously we can't say that this will develop in a separate ground as itself, and more likely will remain limited and case specific for now. But I think we can agree that more and more people, they do lack a meaning, correct and a proper system of values in their lives, and also a meaning in their lives. So in complex cases where a traditional psychological evaluation falls short, noogenic maturity could become a complementary and increasingly recognized ground. When I say ground, I don't mean a ground as itself, but as an element that we can fall under Canon 1095.
Well, thank you, Margaret. This has been a fascinating discussion, and we can wait to see in what way the concept of noogenic immaturity does develop at the level of the Roman Rota, and perhaps in due course at the level of the Code of Canon Law, as we've seen happen in the past with notions such as psychological incapacity or simulation or error or deceit and so on. So thank you for being the English voice, making known this potential new area of development of rotal jurisprudence. And what I'll do in the show notes is I'll include the references to the Spanish article that you mentioned by Monsignor Erlebach, which appeared in Ius Communionis, and your own article in English, although it's in a Polish publication, Ius Matrimoniale. As I say, I'll put those references in the show notes. And in the meantime, I wish you all the best as you continue to combine your work at the tribunal with your responsibilities as wife and mother. And I look forward to being able to talk with you again before too long. So goodbye and God bless.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you again to my guest today, Margaret Koterba, and thank you to Imma Setiadi for her rendition of C.P. Bach's Solfeggetto, which opens and closes this podcast. I'm Fr Paul Hayward, and you've been listening to Canonically Speaking. Please be sure to subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts for more interesting conversations from the world of canon law. Until the next time, thank you and God bless.